Okay, so welcome to a Module 1 practice. So this is just some more practice for you guys to get more comfortable into the material. So this Excel sheet that we're going to use is going to be located if you go to Module 1 and you click on Module 1 Live Classroom Recordings. Click on this Module 1 practice and download it. You don't have to have that printed out. I do suggest watching the live classrooms before watching the practice, but if you've had experience with statistics in the past, or if you feel pretty comfortable with using Excel, you can just jump right into it. Or if you're with me right now, just watching it together is perfectly okay. So let's go ahead and jump back to Excel, and we're going to talk about a few things to begin with. So when you're given an Excel sheet like this, there is a couple things that you should notice. The first thing is that there's some data to the left of the screen. This data is a study that's been collected. So recall that a study is a smaller group of the population. And if we look at part 1, I'm pretty sure I have a little diagram. Maybe it's in part 2. But remember that sample is a smaller collection of the entire population there. So we're looking at a sample, and then each column represents a variable. So here we have two variables. We have the student number and we have the GPA. Now the student numbers are just randomly assigned to students. So to protect their privacy, instead of using names, we're going to use numbers. And this happens a lot in surveys or studies, such as like when you're administering a new drug. To keep secrecy and privacy, HIPAA laws, they often give them numbers instead of using their name. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a little text box here. So just in the Insert tab, click on Text Box, and I'm just going to make some notes here. So there's two variables. There is the student number, and there is the GPA. Okay. And the GPA is a number as well, but this corresponds to their average, right? Their grade point average here. So it's a number between 0 and 4. Those are the possible ranges of values. Now, in part 1, we did learn how to describe these. So remember that you can categorize variables a little deeper. And the first thing we talked about was quantitative and qualitative. So recall that quantitative variables had a numerical response, whereas qualitative were non-numerical. So if we go back here to our Excel sheet, notice that both of the answers are numbers, right? So if they both have numbers, that means that both of these are going to be quantitative. So both of these variables will be considered quantitative. And that's simply because they have number responses here. Okay, both have number responses. Now, another way we categorized our variables was by taking the quantitative variables only. Remember, this doesn't apply to qualitative. Taking the quantitative numbers and breaking them down into discrete and continuous. Now, as a review, discrete values were whole numbers, and continuous had those decimals. So think of discrete as a finite number of possible values or outcomes, whereas continuous had an infinite number of options. This was the example of waiting in line at Starbucks. How long am I going to wait for my coffee? There's an infinite number of options, whereas discrete is like how many outcomes from rolling this ball. Okay, that sort of thing. So if we go over here, One of these options is whole numbers, and whole numbers are just numbers which don't have decimals. Those would correspond to discrete values. So student numbers would also be defined as discrete because you're working with whole numbers. Whereas GPA, notice that there are decimals, right? Indicating an infinite range between 0 and 4. Okay, you can have all these different decimals. So GPA would be considered continuous. Okay, now there was one more level of measurement that we had to describe variables. We had to categorize them by their level of measurement. Now we had 4 levels of measurement. We had nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And these were kind of like stepping stones. So I'm going to use this this little chart here to kind of help us differentiate them. Nominal just basically means that it's either like a name, so almost all qualitative variables would fall into nominal, but they don't really have a number meaning. They don't indicate that like 2 means that there are exactly 2 items. It just is like a random number of 2, okay? And it's usually associated with some qualitative value. So the example we used here with nominal was like, what is your hair color? Hair color was the variable, and we were giving a number response, but it was all linked to qualitative variables. So the numbers were actually linked there to qualitative values. Okay, so nominal, the most basic type of level of measurement. Ordinal is the next level, where the numbers don't have meaning like the number line where it's like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. You know the difference between those values. It's just like random numbers and you're just placing them order. Like, what is your top 3 movies, favorite movies? So like Princess Bride. Oh gosh. Oh, I don't know. That's hard. That's a bad example. Let's say Shrek, and what's another one that I love? The Notebook. There you go. Those are 3 great movies in my opinion. Now, even though I listed all 3, they might not be the same difference between them. I'm just ordering them. Okay, so they're considered ordinal. They're not like on the number line, like 1, 2, and 3. They don't have the same difference between them. Interval is where we actually get to the number line and we can see the difference between them, but there's no real or absolute 0. In other words, 0 doesn't mean 0. We see this in temperature. I use the example of dress size, right? Because 0 should mean that nothing exists. But sometimes it has a different meaning. Like when a dress is a size 0, it still exists. It's just very tiny. Or if you have a temperature of 0, that just means that it's really cold and we don't want to go outside, right? We're in Illinois. We don't want to go outside when it's 0. And then ratio is all of the above. So it's ordered. It's got the meaning of the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it also has that absolute 0. So ratio is the highest level, and I would say nominal and ratio are the most common that you'll see. You don't often see ordinal and interval, so if you're kind of torn between them, usually go with nominal or ratio in your examples. So let's come back here to our example. So again, we have 2 variables. The first one is student number. Now remember, these numbers associate with people. So if student number 1 is attached to like my name, Alicia, it's just randomly assigned. Like I could be attached to 6 maybe or something like that. If they're randomly assigned and they don't have the meaning of 1 means, oh, they're in first place. It doesn't mean that, right? Student 1 does not have the highest GPA. Student 14 does. They're just randomly assigned to people's name. Because of that, they have the lowest level of meaning, meaning that we can do the least amount with them calculations wise. So we would call those nominal. Nominal. So student number is nominal because they aren't attached to any meaning. Whereas, what do you think GPA would be? Keep in mind that it's ordered, right? 0 through 4, but the numbers have meaning, right? The difference between 0 and 1 is the same as 1 to 2, right? They're still like on the number line between 1 to 4. They still have that same meaning. And 0 means that no GPA would exist, right? So that's referred to as a true 0. So GPA would be considered ratio, and that's because it would have a true 0. It's numbered, right? We could order these numbers, and this is going to be the calculation where we can actually do calculations like the mean, median, mode, mid-range, range, variance, and standard deviation. We could do all those calculations with that. Any questions on how to describe the data? Any clarifications? It's just you, Christy. No, you're good? Okay. Awesome. And again, we go more into that in Module 1, Part 1. If you want to get in a few more examples, you can always refer back to that. But let's go ahead and look at the mean, median, mode, which is, hi Sandra, welcome, welcome. We're just working through some Module 1 practice and kind of talking about it in a little bit. Just overview. So in the Module 1, Part 1 and Part 2, I go into depth with these concepts. But for us, we're just going to go ahead and just talk over just brief concepts. So we're on this Module 1 practice Excel sheet, which is in your Module 1 live classroom recordings if you want to grab it. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the measures of center. So remember, measures of center are composed of the mean, median, mode, and mid-range. All the M values, right? So the measures of center are talking about the center of the data, center of the data. So let's start with the arithmetic mean, or the average. In Excel, we use equals average. So over here, we're going to type equals average. Now we're finding the average GPA, so I'm going to click and drag, selecting all my data in the GPA column, close the parentheses, and hit enter. So what you'll see here is that the mean is 2.98 or 2.99 if you want to round up. Usually GPA gets rounded to 2 decimal points, sometimes 3 depending on where you're at. But again, GPA doesn't really have units, so I'm just going to go ahead and put units here, or you could put GPA, but GPA is kind of one of those funky guys that we don't really have units on. Okay, median is the next one. So if I were to describe this, I would say that the mean GPA is 2.98, which is about the average of all of the GPAs in the study, right? This is the sample mean. The next one is the median. Now, oh, did you have a question, Sandra?
Yes, I did.
Sure.
Thank you. I would ask you a question.
Yeah.
Deliver 5. Okay, I remember you said the p-value, and then you have the alpha.
Okay, so we did the mean, which was the average. Let's go ahead and talk about the median. So the median is the middle of the data. So if we were to line all the data up from the smallest to the largest, we would pick that middle value or the average of the two middle values, depending on what the sample size. Luckily, we don't have to do any of that work. We just have to use the formula median in Excel. So let's go ahead and do that together. So median, we just select equals median and select all of our data. Close parenthesis and hit enter. So here the median is 2.98. So if we were to order all this data, which you don't have to do, I'm going to go ahead and order it real quick. You do not have to do this. But if we were to order all the data, we would see that the middle value here is 2.98, right? That's the median value. That's the data that is the value in the middle of all of the data. But again, you don't have to do that. You just have to type in equals median, bang, bang, boom. It's the middle value of all the sorted data. That's all. Now the mode is the value that occurs the most. Now, this one's a little tricky, right? This is the equals mode.mult, and you have to select all the data, type in the formula, select the data, and hit Control, Shift, and Enter at the same time. So let me go ahead and demonstrate it. So the first thing you want to do is select your data, your cells that you want to put the information in. Do not unselect, just select the cells. Type equals mode.mult. And this formula is going to provide multiple modes. We select our data, close parenthesis. Now, normally we just hit enter, right? We can't do that with mode. We have to do Shift, Control, Enter. And what that will do is that's going to give you 3 modes. So this set actually has 3 modes that occur the most: 3.89, 4, and 3.75. And then we have this NA. That just means that there's no more modes. So that's a good sign that you've gotten all the modes. I think on your deliverable, you have quite a few, so I would select like maybe 8 cells or something like that. Just make sure that you see that NA to reassure yourself that you've got all the modes you need. Okay. So these 4 are the measures of center. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with orange. So orange, those are the measures of center. So we have one more that we need to calculate, which is the mid-range. So if we go down here, mid-range is a little funky. So we're going to use the maximum value, add the minimum value, and divide by 2. So the mid-range is like the midpoint. So if you were to take the lowest and highest point, add them together and divide by 2, you're going to get that point in the middle. So let's go ahead and look over here. So right now we don't know what the minimum and maximum value are. So I'm going to add a few cells here to kind of help us figure it out. Like right now, you could probably look at this and know what the minimum and maximum value are, but on your deliverable, that's going to be a little tougher. So instead, we have some formulas. So minimum is MIN, min, and you just select all your data, close parenthesis and hit enter. So the minimum value is 1.7. The maximum value is max, min and max. Those are the formulas. Select all the data and hit enter. So we see a minimum value of 1.7, maximum value of 4. We need to figure out the value in the middle. So the mid-range is going to be equals. Now we have to be careful about parentheses here. So we type equals parentheses. I need to add my minimum and my maximum. So I'm going to use cell referencing to grab those facts. close those parentheses. That's going to add the top and the bottom. Divide by 2. And you've got the mid-range, which is 2.85. Essentially, if we wanted to draw this, I like to draw on mine, so it's always fun. So here's our min, which is 1.7. Here's our max, which is 4. So the value that's right in the middle there is going to be our mid-range, 2. Wow, I can't spell range apparently. Mid-range is going to be 2.85. So that value in the middle. And it happens to be pretty close to our median, which is kind of interesting there, if we think about it. So those are our measures of center. They talk about all the data in the middle. The average, the median, which is the actual middle value if we lined up the data, right? The mode, the values that occur the most, and the mid-range, the data in the center of the range of possibilities. Now, if you watch Part 2, I go into more detail on the advantages and disadvantages and lay that all out. But for right now, I just kind of wanted to briefly go through those formulas again and just review those ideas. So the next set is going to be the measures of variation. So we talked about the center, right? Measures of center, mean, median, mode, mid-range. What about the measures of variation? The rest of the data. The rest of the data tells us how spread out that data is. Is it really spread out or is it really clustered together? We want to know. So there are 3 measures of variation, okay? Range, variance, and standard deviation are all measures of variation. Okay, they tell us how spread out the data is. So the first one is the range, and the range just tells us the difference between the largest value and the smallest value. So if we look here, the range is going to be the difference between the max value of 4 and the minimum value of 1.7. So let me get a different color here. So finding the difference, 4 minus 1.7, is going to get you the range. Basically the distance between the lowest value and the highest. In Excel, what you would do is just type equals, grab the maximum value, and subtract the minimum. And hit enter. So there's a range of about 2.3 values, okay, between max and min. Now, variance starts to talk about how spread out the data is. And so I have this little chart here, but basically a small variance indicates that the data is really close together. They're clustered close together, whereas a large variance indicates that they're pretty spread out from the mean. Okay, they're pretty spread out. So variance is var.s. The s is for sample, so we have to make sure we use that .s. So in here we go var.s, select your data, and hit enter. Now the variance is a pretty small number. It's 0.47. But if you look at the range of numbers, it just means that there's not a whole lot of variety. And if you see, most numbers are somewhere about around 2, right? There's not a lot of variance from those values. Now, another thing to be careful of with variance is that the units on variance are squared. So remember, the units, GPA doesn't really have units, but if they did, like on our example in the video, we did years. When you come to variance, you have to do your units squared. That's how you have to write it, whether it's feet squared years squared, apples squared, whatever the unit is, we're going to square it. Even if it doesn't make sense, you're like, what? Why are apples being squared? Just go with it. Okay. So not too much variance. Now, standard deviation is very similar to variance. It talks about how much the data deviates away from the mean or how spread out the data is. It sounds like the same definition from variance because the numbers actually come from one another. Standard deviation is the square root of the variance. If you took the variance and took the square root of it, you would get the standard deviation. So it's basically just telling you how spread out the data is. And the same applies, right? A small standard deviation indicates not much variance, whereas a large standard deviation indicates a lot of spread of the data. Now, standard deviation formula is STDEV.S. So if we go over here, STDEV.S, and we select the data, hit enter, and you can see that the standard deviation is 0.68. So it doesn't look like these values are going to deviate away from the mean by much. Oh, look at that pun. No, using the definition there, basically, when you have that smaller number, you're indicating that those values are staying close to the mean. They're not, it's very spread out. And the standard deviation goes back to just units because it's the square root of the variance. So again, remember that we talk more about standard deviation and the mean as you get to module 2, 3, 4, 5. We talk about that a little bit more, so it'll make more sense. But for right now, the only other thing that I wanted to talk about is that when we're looking at these values, we can also determine if the distribution is symmetric, right skewed, or left skewed. So recall that right skewed means that we just have some extreme values to the right. Left skewed means that we have extreme values to the left. And to figure this out, you just compare the mean and median. So if we're looking here, the mean is 2.98 and the median is 2.98. Those two values, for all intensive purposes, are equal. Since these two values are equal, that would indicate that it is symmetric. If the mean and median are equal, that means that this distribution is symmetric. Now, if the mean was greater than the median, larger than the median, it would be right skewed. If the mean was less than the median, then it would be left skewed. So I do talk about that a little bit more in the Module 1, Part 2 live classroom, but just keep that in mind as you're answering question number 4. Okay, so again, the answer key's over here. All the same values, yay! But you can kind of see a little bit more how we got that, and then we talked more about the variables. Now, were there any questions on that, Christy, right now? I know it's a very brief overview, but was there anything that you wanted me to kind of show again or talk about more?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Do you feel like you can just kind of jump into the deliverable?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I can.
Cool. Yeah, if you have experience with live classrooms, that's helpful too. Another thing I would suggest is when you're watch Module 1 Part 2, the end of the recording at least, where we talk about what we're looking for in each deliverable. in each question in the deliverable that'll just kind of help situate it so you don't get like an F just because you forgot something, you know, because that's happened before. And then also in part 2, I do talk about the pros and cons of each measure of center and variation, so that can be really good too. Wink, wink.
Okay.
And they're YouTube videos, so you can easily skip around.
Okay.
That's my favorite part. Okay, well, hopefully that was helpful to get started. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to reach out either via email or my other email or text. Yes, instructor information fact sheet. Bing, bang, boom, right there. Thanks so much for coming, Christy. And next
Thank you.
week, I'll do like a module 2.
Okay.
And a short little video. So if you want to watch module 2 before you come, you can.
Yeah.
Just depending where you're at. Because I think module 1 goes pretty fast for most people. But
Okay.
whatever you're feeling.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks for coming tonight. We'll
Thank
talk to you
you.
soon. Bye.
Okay.